This is the Demystifying Mental Toughness podcast, hosted by David Charlton, and you're listening to this podcast to help you build your own mental toughness, or so that you can support other people or your clients better. Either way, you will learn more about developing this plastic personality trait that all but guarantees that you will perform better and lead a more prosperous life. Good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, whatever time of day it is for you. Welcome back to the Demystifying Mental Toughness podcast. So this week, I'm hoping to improve your knowledge of sport and performance psychology and how we can help performers, athletes, and executives. So in mainstream sports psychology, if you are seeking to overcome some sort of challenge or obstacle, the practitioner would likely use approaches such as cognitive restructuring, where we help you change your thought processes so that they're more helpful. We may look at the types of goals that you set and help you get more organized and shift your focus in that respect. Then we've got visualization, which can help in so many different areas, from addressing mental blocks, reducing performance anxiety, boosting confidence, and so on. Then lastly, we've got a form of relaxation training. You could expect something like box breathing, mindfulness, different centering exercises. There's absolutely loads out there which we could look at to help you perform more calmly and to enhance your emotional control. Last of all, we've got sports hypnosis, which is another tool in the toolkit for some practitioners. Personally, it's something that I do draw on quite regularly. Sometimes, despite our best efforts, the many hundreds of interventions that we have access to occasionally don't have the impact that we'd hope with some of the challenges that performers or athletes bring to us. And this is where this podcast episode comes in handy. So brainspotting was a technique that I was introduced to by my colleague Alessia Bruno a few years ago, where she talked about, how she goes about helping people who've been through traumatic episodes, be that crashes, the yips, mental blocks, go on to process the trauma in their brain. Check out episodes 12 and more recently 142 for that. And on this topic, today we're going to build on this, where I interview, that's right, we get back to interviewing on this podcast with Ruth Chiles, author of Focal Dystonia Cure. And again, another brainspotting practitioner. She goes on to talk more about focal dystonia, neurological causes of this condition, and she shares some practical tips for those who struggle with focal dystonia. This episode is a great listen for those who suffer from the yips or mental blocks or have experienced trauma in some form. Enjoy. Hi Ruth, could you just explain to the listeners a little bit about your background and your interest in focal dystonia?
Hi David, thank you for inviting me to chat with you. Yes, so my background is very much in general in performance work. I started actually working in senior management performance for a bank, of all things. Was lucky enough to work with one of the psychologists who worked with us, also worked with the British Olympic track team. We're talking here 30 years ago. So performance coaching, it didn't even really have a name on it back then. And he sort of said to me, well, that weird stuff that you do with the bank managers, do you think that might be of use to for athletes? And I said, well, let's try. And that project was very gratifying. And then from there, as you very well know, the sports world is very small. So, I would then get phone calls from people, word got around, and I got phone calls from people around supporting them in their performance. My personal background around performance is actually as a musician. From there, I then began to work with more and more musicians. Why was I interested in performance? I became interested in performance because I began from probably about the age of 15 to suffer from very severe performance blocks as a musician. So I went from I started playing music when I was about 4 years old. Absolutely adored it, adored performing. It was just fun and play and joyful. There's something for me as a musician, there was something extraordinary about being able to influence people's feelings and moods.
Yeah, it is so powerful, isn't it, music?
It's so powerful, and it was just such a joy for me at that age to perform and to that interrelationship with the audience. And so why by the time I'm 15 years old, am I starting to have panic attacks just looking at my instrument, let alone even going on stage? That really fascinated me. And then at 18 years old, I was preparing for some of my final exams as a musician. And all of a sudden, I couldn't sustain the muscles that surround. So at that point, I played the clarinet. It wasn't an instrument I ever wanted to play. It was an instrument my mother wanted me to play. I wanted to play the flute and the trumpet. Back then, girls couldn't play brass instruments because we didn't have strong enough lungs. And my mother didn't like flute. She didn't like the sound of it, so she signed me up for clarinet lessons. So the muscles are on the corners of my mouth that hold, the clarinet in your mouth. Suddenly I couldn't control them. They just became completely weak, particularly on the right side. And so I couldn't even make a sound out of the instrument because the air would just rush out the corners of my mouth and wouldn't go through the instrument. At that point, I don't think anybody knew what that was. My teachers just told me that I wasn't practicing enough and should practice more. That, the muscle weakness was because I wasn't putting enough effort in. But the more the more I practiced it, I just couldn't make a note. It had nothing to do with, I couldn't even practice. And so at 18, the game over as a musician. So I thought at that point.
I'm going to take you back to something you said there. You said about the weird stuff. Do you find with musicians that they still view it as the weird stuff here? Or do you think, working on performance in different ways is viewed very differently now to what it was maybe 10, 15 years ago?
Mm-hmm. It's definitely viewed very differently now. But I do still think that we've got a long way to go.
Yeah.
And maybe we can talk a little bit about that during this conversation, because I think we really misunderstand which part of the brain that the performance is coming out of and how to engage with that part of the brain. So I think performance is still very neocortically focused, so very much using self-talk, self-will, visualization has its place, but it's actually in a much higher part of the brain from where the performance is coming from. And because that's all very mysterious, because it's in the subconscious part of the brain, subcortical part of the brain, there's been so much myth around performance, myth and superstition around performance.
Right.
And that's the bit that I think we really do have some remarkable tools and some really clear answers for now. And that's where I think we're going, where we will be going over the next maybe 10 to 15 years to broaden the understanding of that.
I'm excited to learn more. You mentioned there that when you were younger, you were told to practice more. Is that generally the type of advice people are given these days then?
So let me talk then a little bit about focal dystonia. Okay, so what happened for me when I couldn't control these muscles any longer is something that's called focal dystonia. Okay, it can happen for any person in any walk of life, but it's particularly clear in musicians and in athletes. And that's just partly because they make their living from doing that. And when the body fails in such a uncontrollable way, and it fails in such a way that they cannot continue with their sport or with their musical career, it's very highlighted. So focal dystonia is the medical term. Other names for it are the yips, writer's cramp, target, panic, dartitis. Has many different common names.
Would that have a link as well in say a sport like gymnastics, where people get mental blocks and one day they just can't perform the skills that they could the previous day?
Yes, absolutely. Yeah.
Do you want to go into some of these neurological causes of focal dystonia?
Yeah. So for me, focal dystonia, following on from your previous question, for me, focal dystonia is just a very extreme somatization in the body of a mental block, or what we might call a mental block, which itself has a much deeper root to it. So what happens in focal dystonia is a particular movement or a particular part of the body starts to go into uncontrollable movements. So for me, it was those muscles around my mouth became really weak. I also had issues with my tongue that I couldn't control the coordination of it when I was tonguing on the instrument, vocalizing on the instrument. For some people, it's in the hand. So for instance, with the yips, it's very often described as I can't let go of the ball, or with the dartitis, darts players say I can't let go of the dart. It's like my hand is gripping on and somehow I can't release.
Yeah.
Often we see with musicians, the fingers curling tightly into the palm or hyperextending. And it's happening. There's no way to control it. It's really difficult for people to understand because people say, well, just relax your fingers. It's like my fingers are doing it on their own. Like I'm possessed by something.
Yeah.
And as much as I try, there's nothing I can do with it. Runners will often find that they have a hip rotation, or their foot will suddenly collapse, or their foot turns in. So it can be in many different, there are different areas of the body where this can manifest. Okay.
No, it makes a lot of sense. Sorry, yeah. So I'm a golfer, and I know I went through a really stressful period of my life. Well, we had probably 15 years or so ago, and I'd never ever had the yips in my putting. And then all of a sudden, I was one of the lucky ones. It didn't go on for a long, long time, but certainly for a few months, I had a few little battles there. So I'm guessing, things like trauma and outside stressors can play a large part in this.
Yes, can play a large part. They are the large part in this. So if we want to go to what's going on in the nervous system that's really sitting underneath these body movements or these body blocks, or, and sometimes it doesn't go any further than a mental block. It's like, I say, I can't remember what to do, or my body just, sometimes it's a mental blank, or sometimes just my body just doesn't respond, and then at a lower level, we see like a less clear level, I suppose. We see players where suddenly, when they need to make the shot, it's like they fail that shot. So there's this whole continuum of things that are going on the inside. Essentially what's happening is that the nervous system is in survival mode. Okay. These have very technical names to them, but I like to put kind of more understandable and common names to them.
Yeah.
Okay. So our nervous system can either feel safe or it can feel under threat. And this is coming out of a very deep part of the brain, the reptilian part of the brain. So it doesn't understand subtleties. It doesn't understand, this is a slightly stressful situation. For that part of the brain, or your life is at risk or you're completely safe. And there's nothing in between. So for that part of the brain, any level of stress feels like a real life threat and will respond according to that. So we have 3 essential responses. One will be a fight response. So oftentimes we see, and we've seen this quite recently, there's been a lot of coverage of this in tennis recently. Tennis players who just have a rage, like they get so angry on court and, throwing the racket and shouting, and, that's a fight response. The nervous system can go into a flight response. So that's a feeling, I've just got to get away from this. I can't stand being here.
So that sorry, I'm interrupting there. So in effect, the tennis player in that respect, what would potentially give up if they had the flight response?
Yes, they're likely to give up, or they're certainly likely to, when the ball's coming towards them, they've not got that sense of going into the ball. There's a sense of moving away from the ball.
Yeah, makes sense. Yeah.
Okay. And likewise, you can imagine if you're in a team sport and you're in defence and you have another player really coming at you fast in order to score. If your nervous system goes into flight, it's almost impossible to have that sense of just like really holding your ground against them. And they're often very, very subtle. It's like, because the thinking part of the brain is kind of like knows what it's got to do, but the muscles are pulling back. Yeah. So there's just that lack of edge is what we will often see in terms of what the performance looks like from the outside.
Yeah. And as you say, all of this is happening at an unconscious level.
Yeah. And it's happening at 11 million bits of information per second.
Wow. The brain can certainly take on a lot of information.
Yet our thinking brain, so, for those of us who kind of do a lot of self-talk in terms of our playing, the thinking brain is only working at 60 bits of information per second. And the body's working at 11 million.
Right. Yeah. There's such a huge difference there.
Yeah.
So you also mentioned about freezing as well?
Yes. So our third response is going to be freeze. Now, freeze is much more complex than we think it is. Okay. And freeze is a big issue around performance in general, but it's a particular big issue around focal dystonia. Okay. So the freeze response, so we could talk about fight and flight as being hyper activation in the nervous system. The nervous system starts running faster than than it needs to in order to respond to the threat. The freeze response is what's called a hypoactivation. Okay. Now, what's happening in the freeze response is there are two potential things that are happening in the freeze response. One is that the body is becoming completely still so that the perceived threat, the perceived predator doesn't see you. Right, you become invisible.
Yeah.
Okay. But there's a cost that's happening. If we're looking at performance, what's happening is the breath becomes as shallow as possible so that you just have a minimum amount of breath to be able to stay alive, but no more than that.
Okay.
Okay.
This is taking me back to last October. We've got a little puppy, and we took it out the first time in a park playground, and it got attacked by a much bigger dog. I froze. It just taking me back to that moment. Yeah. I couldn't do anything. It was crazy.
Right. So, and the muscles become frozen. It's that you can't move them. Okay, as much as you would want to, you're unable to move them. Okay, so that's about becoming still. But then there's an even deeper response that can follow that, or can come in right from the beginning. The technical name is dorsal vagal collapse. Okay, that's where the deep brain is saying, not only is there no way out of this, so we go into freeze when something in the deep brain registers, the predator's too strong for me to fight, and there's no escape. So I go into freeze. Okay. The deepest part of that freeze response is where the deep brain goes, and there really is no way out. This is the end. So what happens when the body prepares itself for that? So actually you just don't want to know anything about that. It's like we completely disconnect. And what happens is the whole nervous system goes into a collapse. Now that means we go into a collapse mentally. There's just a sense of complete giving up. And I think many of us who are in performance moment, who do perform, we know that feeling of where it's like we can just feel all our kind of mind just go into this kind of like I can't engage any longer with what's happening.
Yeah, I can remember in the US Masters golf tournament, maybe about 3 or 4 years ago, a player called Ernie Els, who he had a putt about this long on the first hole. He knocked it past, and then that was painful to watch. We went back and forth about 5-6 times, guessing that was something like that is happening to him.
Yes. Yeah. And then it's like we lose the strength in our muscles. We lose, that we've had that feeling when we've had a shock and the legs go to jelly, right? The muscles literally feel like they're completely weak and can't function. And there's just this almost feels like the whole energy drains out of our body in that state. And again, that's happening at 11 million bits of information per second. So even though I'm trying to keep myself focused and keep myself in the game, the conscious part of my brain is just so slow and weak compared with what's happening in the body. Okay. So some of us our nervous system has become in a constant state of survival. And that's often happened because of our very early life history. It's quite complex to go into now, but our basic needs, other than our basic kind of food, shelter, warmth, water, those that are all there. But we have another basic survival need, which is the attachment to our mother and her attunement to us. Okay. So what do I mean by that? What I mean is that babies, we're completely defenseless. We know that we are safe when we know that my mother has me in her mind and in her energy field, in her sense of me, is there all of the time. So that she instinctively knows when I'm hungry. She instinctively knows if I'm cold. She instinctively knows if I'm thirsty and will take care of those needs because I can't tell her. That's a maternal instinct that she's following in order to respond to that. Then the other thing to remember about that is we don't come into being when we're born. We've already had 9 months of being in a psychological, emotional, spiritual, and physical relationship with our mother. So, and when we're born, we don't know that we're separate. It's just mother-baby unit. I mean, we are mum. So if for some reason she's not there, for whatever that might be, maybe she was ill, maybe I was ill, maybe I was born too small and I was put in an incubator. There are many different reasons why that happens. In my case, I was adopted. So I was actually, taken away from my mother at birth. And so for me, I feel like I've died because that sustains me, that I am is not here. So it literally feels like part of me has died. And that installs a very deep dorsal vagal collapse. within the nervous system right from the go. Okay. It may not be that dramatic. It just may be, that mum was too busy, or mum had her own problems, her own issues, and she couldn't quite connect into me, and I'm perceiving that.
Do you see an increase in that these days? Because obviously, times have changed a lot now, where the vast majority of mothers are working full time, essentially. So would you say there's been a shift in the last 20, 30 plus years?
I think so. And I think the shift is, and this is something I think that's important for us to move on to talk about, is that sense of not being deeply held has become normalized. We think that's normal.
But actually, it causes issues further down the line.
Yes, exactly. And we're talking about really big questions here, because this is complicated. I'm certainly not saying mums shouldn't go out to work and they should all be stay at home with our kids, until they're 7 years old, which is the time frame in which that initial individuation in a child happens. I'm not saying that, but there is an impact on us. It's about recognizing that when that's happening, it does impact us. And it impacts our sense of safety in the world, and it impacts our connection to ourselves. Because if my mother is attuning to me, then I can be at peace, because I know that there's nothing I need to do. If she's not attuning to me, I have to come out of myself to attune to her as a survival response.
Okay.
And because I can't conceive mother as being anything less than perfect, it installs a deep sense of I'm not enough, or there's something fundamentally flawed in me.
Okay, so then self-esteem issues can be as a result.
Right. So because there's this sense of she's not attending to me because there's something wrong with me, not because there's something wrong with her, right? And there's not really, the truth is there's nothing wrong with anybody. It's just a set of circumstances, right? But a baby brain can't conceive that. So then we start to get these really subtle but very deep survival patterns built into us. One is literally happening at the level of the nervous system and the speed that the nervous system is moving at. For most children, it's actually almost impossible for them to stay in a collapsed state. So what happens is they get an override happen in their nervous system. So it goes into hyperactivity as a constant, as a sort of cover up for that sense of needing to collapse. And then there's also these other more complex issues that are going on around overtrying, trying too hard, trying to please other people, being strong, being perfectionist, because if I'm fundamentally flawed, if I could only do it perfect, then I would be all right. And so they're not happening in the thinking brain. We can find sense of them when we bring them up to the thinking brain, but this is actually happening on a much deeper level in terms of some very instinctive movements that we're making in life.
Ooh, this is really fascinating, and obviously very, very, very complex. I'm intrigued. You talk there about children and they go into the hypo state. So let's think about the practical tools that are there to help them. So supposing there's a gymnast approaches you, who's a youngster, and they lose their skills and they do get into this hypo state. How do you go about supporting them?
So the main tool that I use is a tool called brainspotting. Okay, brainspotting was developed by a New York psychologist called David Grand, who I will be eternally grateful to for discovering. I think is probably the best way, because this is natural. This is something that our brain is naturally doing all of the time. So he's discovered it and he's refined it so that we can use it very precisely. So anybody can try this out. Okay. If you think of a memory, or you think of, if you're a sports person, you think of a particular movement, you will find that your eyes have gone somewhere. They've shifted position in order to recall that information. So what that means is the optic nerve, where the optic nerve connects into the deep brain, it actually scans the brain. It has this ability to scan the brain to decide where to store the experiences that we've had today. This is normally happening in the REM sleep, the rapid eye movement sleep, but it also is a retrieval mechanism. So if we want to remember something, our eyes go to the place that our optic nerve is stimulating that part of the brain to retrieve that information.
Okay. Would that very much be like, I suppose, going to retrieve it in a hard drive of a computer, essentially?
Yeah, we could relate it to it in that way. So what does that mean? That means if I can go back to what got stuck in the past, I'm talking as you're getting the idea, there's actually a lot of complexity with this about how, what we're looking for and how we're working with the brain spotting. But on the most simple terms, if I can go back to the past where, for instance, my baby brain began to install that I have to try hard and harder and harder and harder in order to be okay, but I can connect with that with my whole adult brain, I can start to realize that that's not true. And I can actually rewire. The brain is highly plastic. So I can actually rewire that part of the brain to start to have different responses.
Okay, so this is where obviously the brain spotting comes into place.
Yeah.
So using the computer hard drive, are you essentially like, I suppose, wiping the hard drive and getting rid of like past memories, or I wouldn't
say we're getting rid of them, because I don't think we can get rid of the past memories, but we're rewiring them so that we keep all the strengths of them, right? Try hard has lots of strengths with it. Yeah. I know that the discipline that I've had in my life and the constancy that I've had in my life has been one of my greatest assets. I've achieved a lot and many things that I'm delighted with because of that degree of discipline and because of that degree of constancy that I've had, right? So we want to keep all of that because that's really valuable.
Yeah.
What we want to release is the compression that's around it, the fear, the survival issue around it, that if I don't, I won't get anywhere. I've got, that kind of like impulsive, compulsive, compressed feelings around it. Because let's remember, if we're in survival, if our brain is in survival mode, our nervous system is in survival mode, our large muscle groups are primed. So we don't have fluidity of muscle movement. Now that's going to affect our performance, but it also opens us to injury. But more importantly, or as importantly, when we're in survival mode, we don't need fine motor skills. If you need to fight your way out of something or run away, your fine motor skills are of no use. So your brain wants to direct all the energy into the large muscle groups. If you go into freeze, likewise, why would you want fine motor skills? You want the large muscle groups to become frozen and still. So the brain literally inhibits fine motor skills when your nervous system is in survival mode.
Okay, this makes a lot of sense, yeah.
Mm-hmm. So what we want to be able to do is we want to keep all the value of those earlier experiences, but we want to bring the nervous system into safety so that I can engage with my sports, with my practice, with my life from a place of safety where those then become kind of skills and abilities that I've got, but my mind and my body is free to move with them with fluidity.
Okay. So for an athlete who didn't necessarily invest in like working with someone like yourself in brain spotting, and they were looking for simple, sort of practical, everyday strategies to try and help themselves with some of these physical ailments, are we talking about understanding and using the breath better and likes of yoga practice, that sort of thing?
Yoga practice and meditation are wonderful. Then it's about coming back into the center would be my advice. So there are 3 key practices that I give people to do, and anybody can do this on their own. I even have YouTube videos if anybody wants to go in and take a look at them where I guide people through them. One of them is something that I call the attunement repair exercise. That's the ability to come back to your body and develop your interoceptive sensitivity or perception of what's happening in your body. So one of the things that happens when we're in survival mode is we dissociate, we disconnect from the physical body. We override the information that it's telling us. So what we want to be able to do is come back into that information, because if I am able to recall at any time the exact movement that is required, not think it through, but my body has that recall of exactly how it feels when it's making that movement, then I can make that completely repeatable. So that's really important as a different way of training our body into the movements that it needs to make for a level of precision that we require. Then the second exercise is something that I call the zero state exercise. And that's literally being able to feel the pelvic bowl, being able to feel the hips, the bones that form the pelvic bowl. And they're kind of like, you can start to feel them like the wall of a bowl. And then the brain naturally naturally. So you literally just feel into it. Spend a few moments feeling into that. And then naturally the brain infills the inside of it. And what you're doing is you're connecting to the center of gravity of your body. It's remarkable. When we connect into the center of gravity of the body, all our muscles become really engaged but really relaxed at the same time.
Okay.
And the mind becomes completely clear and relaxed too. So it's a really fast way of accessing safe mode in the nervous system.
Right. Okay. Yeah, I'm gonna try that. Yeah. I know I've read a lot about like John Kabat-Zinn's work and like body scans, and actively practiced for a while. So yeah, I'm going to try that. Yeah. And certainly check out some of your YouTube videos, which I would most definitely recommend the listeners to do as well.
And then the last exercise is called the kindness state exercise, and we can do it either directly through the body or through a memory of when we're being kind to somebody else, and you come to that feeling of warmth and softness in the center of the chest that happens with that kindness. Now, what's interesting about kindness, when we feel that in our body, that heals the center of the brain, the centers in the brain that have become depleted as a result of those early experiences.
Okay, so is there links there with compassionate focus therapy?
There are. I think the particular, it's a subtlety that I put, and I'm not going to say it's different because I know that this is in many other approaches as well. But the important part is feeling it in your body, not in your mind.
Okay.
It's the felt sense in your body and the direct experience of that that's important. That's where the healing comes from. And what's interesting is out of that, I noticed there's a whole different coordination into the arms and the hands, if we're looking just at a physiological level. So those 3 core exercises are really remarkable, and they're really important in terms of bringing the nervous system back into safety. And from there, you can begin to understand how often you're in survival mode without even realizing it. When you feel competitive, you're in survival mode. When you feel like you've got to win, you're in survival mode. When you feel like pushing through, you're in survival mode. And so you start to be able to actually notice the difference, and above all, notice the difference in your body, how the body feels tight and constricted and the mind feels tight and constricted in those other forms of being.
It's fascinating. This all of the things you've mentioned there as well are messages people hear in certainly in sport every day. Try harder, do your best, give maximum effort, all of those things. So yeah, we could go on for a long time.
I know we're running out of time. What a shame.
Most definitely. I think we might have to catch up again. In terms of like 3 key takeaways for the listeners, from our conversation, what would they be?
I think the first one would be is that your movement comes out of your subcortex, that 11 million bits of information. We connect to the subcortex through the body, not through the thinking mind. Okay. The second would be that the survival mode is going to impede fluidity in your large muscles, and it inhibits your fine motor skills.
Okay.
So there's a high price for being in survival mode. And the third is that you take your whole life history into performance moment. Okay. We can't separate performance from all of us. We can't go, okay, I'm going to switch into performance. Your whole life history is there in that moment.
Brilliant. And basically people can obviously access this information through your YouTube channel. You've got a blog, and you've also got a fantastic book as well. Would you like to tell the listeners about your book and signpost on there? The relevant bits of information.
So the book is called The Focal Dystonia Cure. You can buy it through Amazon. It's available worldwide through Amazon, and it's a really practical book. So I talk about it's in 3 parts. The neurological causes of the blocks in the body. Although it's specifically about focal dystonia, you can apply this to any mental or physical block in your performance. The second part is, where does that come from? Why did the brain get changed in that way? And then the third part is a series of practical exercises. So there's an arc of different exercises that you can use. First, to develop the safe mode, as we just talked about, and then how you can do self-spotting in order to, so I guide you through how to do that in order to then start to release the activation in your nervous system that's, in the tensions and mental tensions, emotional tensions and physical tensions in your body.
Yeah, so listeners, please do check the book out. It's got some great stuff in there. So yeah, big thank you for your time, Ruth. It's been fantastic chatting to you, and the listeners are going to get so much from this. you've got a website as well, haven't you? And are you on social media at all?
I am. So you can find me just on social media. Then my website is thefocaldystoniacure.com. Yeah. So check me out. Check out the website. Love to hear from you all. And it's been gorgeous conversation, David. Thank you so much.
Yeah, no, thank you too. So I sincerely hope that you enjoyed this episode of Demystifying Mental Toughness. It certainly opened my eyes, and I hope it's opened your eyes and your mind as to why mental blocks do occur, what goes on in the brain when you are suffering, and importantly, I'm hoping it's going to give you some hope. There are very skillful practitioners like Ruth and my colleague Alessia who really can help you if you do struggle with mental blocks. I see how debilitating it really can be. You can feel so helpless, despite giving maximum effort. A lot of people go on to quit their sports, but it doesn't have to be that way. And, one thing, when we relate this to mental toughness, the mentally tough will ask for help in this regard. They will be resourceful if they do face a challenge like this. So feel free to get in touch. We can have a conversation about how Alessia might be able to help you. In the meantime, try and have a good week. That's right. Try and have a fun week ahead. Good luck. If you enjoyed this episode of the Demystifying Mental Toughness podcast with David Charlton, do check out my website, sport-excellence.co.uk, and my online sports psychology resources. The Sport Excellence website has essential resources for anyone looking to build their own mental toughness or the mental toughness of their athletes or teams, or if you want to achieve peak performance more often or optimal functioning. The Sport Excellence website has everything you need to keep moving forward and thrive. So go on, head over to sport-excellence.co.uk to find out more.